Usually when we look back at a massive historical catastrophe, we expect to find this really clear straight line.
Oh, like a neat little row of dominoes.
Exactly. Like event A happens, which triggers event B, that knocks right into event C, and suddenly, boom, you have a disaster. It's clean, it's logical, and honestly, it's deeply comforting to think that way.
Yeah, for sure. It makes us feel like we have control.
Right. We like to believe that if we can just spot that first domino wobbling, we can step in and stop the whole chain reaction. But when you look at the origins of totalitarianism, which, by the way, is our mission for this deep dive today, Friday, June 5th, 2026, you realize that neat little row of dominoes, it is completely gone.
It never even existed in the first place.
Exactly. We're looking at a historical landscape that is just incredibly murky, chaotic, and, frankly, terrifyingly complex. So today we're going to dive into Hannah Arendt's seminal 1951 work, The Origins of Totalitarianism.
Such a monumental text.
It really is. And we're using a stack of excerpts and critical reviews to sort of extract the warnings this text holds for us right now, in our current digital era.
Yeah, and I think it's important to state right up front that Arendt completely dismantles that comforting illusion of the falling dominoes. She just tears it apart.
She doesn't let us off the hook with easy answers, does she?
Not at all. Her methodology insists that comprehension does not mean, deducing the unprecedented from precedents, or just explaining things away with neat historical analogies. She forces you to look at the outrageous reality of what happened in the 20th century without flinching.
And without trying to cram it into a traditional cause and effect model.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's unpack this. Because if it's not a chain reaction, if A didn't just mechanically cause B, then how on earth do we explain the descent into the horrors of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia? Like, if she throws out the standard historical timeline, what does she replace it with?
So she introduces this framework she calls the method of crystallization.
Crystallization. Okay, how does that work?
Well, Arendt doesn't argue that, say, 19th century antisemitism directly produced the Holocaust, or that overseas imperialism mechanically generated totalitarianism. That would be falling back on the domino theory.
Right, which we just threw out.
Exactly. Instead, she identifies these discrete, seemingly unrelated subterranean streams of Western history. So you have the specific, highly unusual function of Jewish populations in the European nation-state.
Okay, that's one stream.
Right. Then you have the economic logic of limitless imperialist expansion. And third, you have the profound social atomization of European societies.
People becoming totally isolated.
Yeah. And for a long time, these were just separate, parallel historical tributaries. They weren't really interacting in a catastrophic way. But under the intense, specific pressures of the 20th century, they collided.
They reacted with each other.
They did. They reacted and they crystallized into something wholly unprecedented. A form of government whose ultimate purpose wasn't just tyranny, but the actual fabrication and destruction of human beings as human beings.
Wow. That concept of crystallization changes everything about how we view danger, I think. It means toxic elements can just sort of float around in the solution of society for decades, seemingly harmless.
Or at least manageable.
Yeah, right. Manageable. Just waiting for the exact right temperature and pressure to suddenly snap into this rigid, deadly crystal. And that's exactly why this deep dive matters so much for you listening today.
It really is a manual.
It's a literal manual for recognizing how isolated individuals, a fractured sense of truth, and the breakdown of community can pave the way for catastrophe right now. But before we examine those historical tributaries, I think we need to look at the architect of this theory.
Oh, absolutely. Hannah Arendt's own life is essential to understanding her work.
Because she wasn't observing this from a safe, detached university tower somewhere. She was forged in the very crucible she was diagnosing.
Yeah, her lived experience provides an unparalleled authority of proximity. I mean, to really grasp the weight of her arguments, you have to understand her personal trajectory.
Where does her story start?
So Arendt was born in 1906 in Hanover, into a secular German Jewish family. And she was this brilliant mind studying philosophy under absolute giants like Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers.
Just a total academic rising star.
Exactly. But that academic ascent was violently interrupted. In 1933, she was actually arrested by the Gestapo.
Wait, really? Just for being Jewish, or was she involved in something specific?
She was researching anti-Semitic propaganda. She was gathering materials for a Zionist organization to document what was happening.
Wow. To be a young scholar sitting in a library, and suddenly the secret police are hauling you away. That just shatters any illusion that philosophy is disconnected from real-world consequences.
It really does. Now, she managed to flee Germany for Paris shortly after her release. But the political nightmare of Europe just kept expanding. By 1940, the Vichy government in France interned her in the Gurs camp.
Which is just wild. She flees Germany, goes to France for safety, and then France locks her up.
Yeah, they classified her as an enemy alien. She miraculously escaped the camp during the chaos of the German invasion of France, and she eventually secured passage to the United States in 1941.
An incredible escape story. But there's a legal detail here that is crucial, right?
Yes. Yes. The critical detail, the one that anchors her entire political philosophy, is that she arrived in New York stateless. The German government had officially stripped her of her citizenship back in 1937.
So she belonged nowhere.
Nowhere. For over a decade, Hannah Arendt did not legally belong to any country on Earth.
I want to linger on that for a second, because that lived experience of being stateless, of literally being wiped off the legal map, feels like the engine of her entire worldview. She experienced firsthand what happens when the abstractions of law meet the brutal reality of having no state to back you up.
Precisely. And this is where she really starts to target the grand, sweeping declarations of the 18th century. You know, the American Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man.
Right. The foundation of those documents is what we call natural rights liberalism.
Yeah, exactly.
But pause there. Natural rights liberalism. Just to keep us grounded, we're talking about the Enlightenment idea, right? Like the John Locke concept that you are born with fundamental rights simply because you draw breath.
Right, regardless of who your king is or where you live.
Yes, exactly.
And that is precisely the concept Arendt takes aim at. The Enlightenment argued that human rights were inalienable, right, existing independent of any government. But Arendt, sitting in an internment camp in France or arriving in New York with no passport, realized this was practically vacuous.
Because it didn't match her reality at all.
It didn't. The moment human beings lacked their own government, the moment they had to fall back on their absolute minimum rights as mere human beings, it turned out there was no earthly authority left to protect them. The universe didn't step in to enforce their rights.
Right, because if a right is truly inalienable, it means it cannot be taken away, period. But hers were taken away extremely easily.
Frighteningly easily.
Okay. Let me try an analogy here to see if this makes sense. It's like being promised a seat at a VIP table in a very exclusive restaurant. You are told this is your fundamental human right to sit at this table.
Okay, I like where this is going.
But then you arrive and you realize you don't even have a ticket to get into the building itself. The building is locked. And without access to the building, the promise of the VIP chair inside is completely meaningless. You're just standing out in the cold.
That is a perfect way to look at it. You are left with what Arendt calls the abstract nakedness of being human.
Abstract nakedness. That's a powerful phrase.
And she argues that this nakedness actually makes you more vulnerable. You know, almost like a savage in a state of nature.
Wait, how does it make you more vulnerable? Shouldn't just being human count for something?
You'd think so. But the ticket to the building, in your analogy, is membership in a political community. From this horrifying realization, she developed her most groundbreaking concept, the right to have rights.
The right to have rights.
Yes. The fundamental deprivation of the stateless wasn't the loss of free speech or the loss of a fair trial. It was the loss of a political community that makes any of those secondary rights possible in the first place.
Because rights aren't magic.
Exactly. Rights are not naturally given by God or nature. They are politically constructed. They're artificially created by human communities. And when that community kicks you out, you lose the very framework that recognizes you as a human being worthy of protection.
You essentially drop off the radar of humanity. You become what she terms the scum of the earth, the stateless person. And looking at the sources, they point out an incredibly dark paradox here regarding the legal system.
Well, the criminal paradox, it's so twisted.
Right. To get any protection at all, a stateless person was almost better off committing a crime. How does that twisted logic even work?
Well, Arendt observes that if a stateless person commits a crime, say a small burglary, their legal position actually improves.
Which sounds completely backwards.
It does, but think about it. As a stateless person, they are an anomaly. An outlaw by definition purely for existing. They are completely at the whim of the police, who can just deport them or intern them without trial.
Because they have no legal standing whatsoever.
Exactly. But the moment they steal something, they become a recognized offender. The legal system knows how to process a thief.
Oh, wow. So the crime forces the system to acknowledge them.
Yes. They get a lawyer, they get a trial. They are suddenly protected from arbitrary police deportation because they now fall under the jurisdiction of penal law. They literally become a respectable person in the eyes of the law simply by breaking it.
That is just staggering. You have to violate the law just to be seen by it. And honestly, thinking about the millions of forcibly displaced persons globally today, refugees, undocumented migrants, warning feels incredibly urgent.
It absolutely is. Her warning is that losing your political status is the psychological precondition for the world to turn a blind eye to your extermination.
Right, because the totalitarian regimes didn't start with death camps. They started by stripping citizenship. They rendered people stateless first.
They were testing the waters. They wanted to see if any other country would step up and claim these people. And when the world proved it didn't care about people who were merely human, the path to extermination was wide open.
It's terrifying how methodical it was, which leads us directly into the first of the 3 subterranean streams she identified: antisemitism.
Yes, the first major tributary in her crystallization theory.
Arendt investigates how the Jewish people became so fatally entangled with the fate of the European nation-state that they became the primary target of this massive statelessness experiment. And looking at her text, she makes a highly contested, aggressive distinction right out of the gate regarding the very nature of antisemitism.
She does. She vehemently distinguishes between historical, religious Jew hatred, which is rooted in medieval Christian theological antagonism, and modern secular political anti-Semitism,
which she defines as a distinct 19th century ideology.
Correct.
But why does she slice it so thin? I mean, to a lot of people, hatred is just hatred. Why does the origin matter so much to her analysis?
It's a great question. Treating anti-Semitism as just this unbroken, eternal, 2,000-year-old hatred certainly provides emotional resonance. But Arendt argues it creates a severe analytical distortion.
How so?
Because if you say, well, people have always hated Jews, it's just human nature or some eternal curse, you are engaging in intellectual escapism. You're treating it as a natural phenomenon, like a hurricane, rather than a specific political tool that was wielded by specific people.
Oh, I see. You're basically letting the actual perpetrators off the hook by saying it's just the way things are.
Exactly. To really comprehend the Holocaust, she insists we must look at the highly specific political and economic functions Jews held in modern Europe, specifically their relationship to the nation-state as the Staatsvolk.
The Staatsvolk, meaning the state people. Let's break down that relationship, because we're not talking about the entire Jewish population of Europe being wealthy bankers, obviously.
No, not at all.
We're talking about a specific dynamic between the ruling elite and a certain subset of the Jewish community.
Right. So from the 17th century onward, European monarchs were building these massive centralized nation-states. And to do that, they required huge amounts of capital to finance standing armies and expanding bureaucracies.
State building is expensive.
Very. And certain individual Jewish families, initially known as the court Jews and later massive banking families, served these specific financial needs. They could float government loans across borders precisely because they had these transnational family networks.
So they basically acted as a private international financial infrastructure for governments. Governments that, let's be real, were constantly at war with one another.
Exactly. They were incredibly useful to the kings and state builders.
But this creates a dangerous paradox, doesn't it? Because they provided these vital services, they were granted special protections by the state. They were elevated above ordinary civil society.
Yes, but crucially, they didn't belong to any specific national class.
Right. They weren't the peasants. They weren't the industrial workers.
Yeah.
And they certainly weren't the traditional landed aristocracy.
They were floating, intimately tied to state power, but completely aloof from the society itself.
And that aloofness became their fatal vulnerability.
It absolutely did, because by the late 19th century, the nation-state began to decline. State finance democratized. Governments started selling bonds directly to ordinary citizens. Plus, imperialist ventures created entirely new avenues for capitalist financing.
So suddenly, the state didn't need the specific, exclusive services of the court Jews anymore.
The state moved on, but the Jewish wealth remained.
And that's the trigger. The wealth remained, but their specific political function disappeared.
Yes. Arendt draws heavily on Tocqueville's analysis of the French aristocracy right before the revolution here. Tocqueville pointed out that people can tolerate wealth and oppression if it seems to serve some kind of function in the social order.
Like an oppressive lord at least provides military defense, or organizes the harvest.
Yeah.
You might hate him, but you see why he's there.
Exactly. But wealth without power, wealth without a visible societal function, that is intolerable to the masses. It looks entirely parasitic.
So as the European masses entered political life and started suffering these massive economic shocks, they looked around for a scapegoat.
And they saw the Jews. Wealthy, highly visible, but politically powerless and belonging to no national community.
And Arendt takes us right into the living rooms of the European elite to show how this played out socially. She draws this totally fascinating distinction between the parvenu and the pariah. How did Jewish individuals navigate a society that resented them but was superficially willing to admit them?
Well, society in the 19th century was willing to admit Jews into high society, but only as exceptions, like curiosities. You were admitted not as an equal citizen, but precisely because you were exotic or different.
Which is incredibly demeaning.
It is. And faced with this conditional acceptance, Arendt observes two primary psychological responses. The first is the parvenu.
The parvenu. Who are they?
The parvenu is the assimilated Jew who desperately seeks acceptance on the dominant society's terms. They trade on their Jewishness as a cultural commodity while desperately denying any political reality or solidarity with the Jewish masses.
They perform normality. They try to buy their way into safety.
Exactly. They play the role society wants them to play.
Let me test an analogy on you to see if this captures the dynamic.
Yeah.
Because I think this is a very human psychological response.
Go for it.
It's like being in a highly cutthroat, morally compromised corporate environment. The parvenu is the executive who climbs the ladder by abandoning all their core values. They laugh at the CEO's offensive jokes. They throw their own colleagues under the bus. They become a caricature of whatever the dominant culture demands.
Yep, just to keep their seat at the executive table.
Right. They think their compliance buys them security.
That maps perfectly onto the dynamic Arendt is describing. And then you have the alternative response, the pariah.
The pariah.
The pariah is the outsider who refuses to play that corporate game. They refuse the humiliating terms of admission. They maintain their critical integrity, but they pay the price of total social marginality.
They sit alone at lunch.
They do. But Arendt deeply sympathized with the pariah. She looked up to figures like Heinrich Heine or Franz Kafka. The pariah keeps their soul and actually gains genuine political insight because they are looking at the system from the outside.
Whereas a parvenu sells out for a false sense of security that ultimately won't save them anyway.
Exactly. The corporate whistleblower who gets isolated versus the climber who sells out. The pariah sees clearly how toxic the system actually is.
But in this historical context, the stakes aren't just getting fired. They are literal life and death. Because while the parvenus thought they were safe in their elite salons, the political reality outside was turning lethal. The resentment toward the state people was being weaponized.
Actively weaponized by political actors.
Which brings us to what Arendt calls the dress rehearsal for the 20th century horrors, the Dreyfus Affair. I feel like this is such a pivotal moment in her argument.
It really is. The Dreyfus Affair in France at the end of the 19th century is a terrifying case study of this weaponization. In 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jewish officer in the French army, was falsely convicted of treason.
He was framed.
Completely framed. But Arendt isn't just interested in the miscarriage of justice itself. She focuses on what the affair exposed about the structural fragility of French society.
What did it expose?
It revealed that the mob, the army, the Catholic Church, and the press could all unite and weaponize anti-Semitism against the Republic itself.
Wait, so it wasn't just a few bigoted individuals in the military?
No, it was a massive, systemic, organized political weapon, and they used it to attack the very concept of constitutional democracy. It proved that the normal mechanisms of a liberal democracy, the courts, the rules of evidence, due process, were completely insufficient to shield a minority from organized political hatred.
That's the scariest part.
Yeah.
The institutions failed.
Completely. It took 12 years to officially exonerate Dreyfus, and the whole ordeal brought the French Republic to the brink of collapse. Arndt's sobering lesson here is that even in a highly developed, functioning democracy, anti-Semitism can serve as the catalyst to threaten the entire constitutional order.
And if it could do that to a functioning, relatively stable republic like France, just imagine what it could do when the constitutional order is completely shattered.
Which is exactly what happens later.
Right. And that is the perfect transition to the second massive tributary in Arndt's crystallization process. Imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
The nation-state is failing to integrate its minorities at home, and simultaneously, it begins to fail abroad.
The domestic failure pushes the external failure.
Let's look at the era of high imperialism, roughly 1884 to 1914. How does the failure of capitalism at home drive the horrors abroad?
Well, Arendt views imperialism fundamentally as the political emancipation of the bourgeoisie. For a long time, the capitalist middle class was content to just accumulate wealth and leave the actual business of governing to the state.
Like, you run the country, we'll make the money.
Exactly. But eventually, capitalist accumulation hit a ceiling within the borders of the European nation-states. They had all this surplus capital, and they needed new places to invest it profitably. They essentially ran out of room to grow.
So they are pushed outward, they have to expand globally, not for ideological reasons initially, but purely for economic survival.
Driven entirely by profit.
And they bring their core business principle with them, which is expansion for expansion's sake. Arendt quotes the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes in the text, who famously said, "Expansion is everything. I would annex the planets if I could."
That quote perfectly encapsulates the madness of the imperialist mindset.
It's so revealing. It's just endless appetite.
It is a logic of limitless, purposeless growth. It's not about building a stable community. It's a ravenous appetite. And that logic shattered the very concept of the nation-state.
How so?
Because a nation-state is based on a shared legal community and a bounded territory. It has borders. You cannot endlessly expand it and force your constitutional laws onto conquered peoples halfway across the globe, especially when you view those people as racially inferior.
Right. The tension between the nation, which is a closed legal entity, and empire, which is limitless expansion, was completely unresolvable.
Unresolvable. And so if they couldn't extend their constitution to the people in Africa and Asia, what did they do? They didn't integrate the colonies. They invented an entirely new form of rule.
Bureaucratic administration by decree.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where things get incredibly dark. In the colonies, European administrators wielded unaccountable violence. They ruled without any laws, without parliaments, without any constitutional checks and balances.
Just raw administrative power over millions of people.
Yes. And this colonial laboratory is where Arendt locates the profound shift in race thinking.
Let's clarify that, because race thinking had existed in Europe before,
Yeah.
right? But mostly as a sort of class snobbery.
Yeah, exactly. Aristocrats claiming they had better blood than peasants. It was domestic. But in the colonies, faced with overwhelming numbers of native populations and need to justify brutal subjugation, that domestic class snobbery crystallized into systematic biological racism.
It became an administrative tool.
Yes. It justified treating native populations not as humans with rights, but as administrative problems. Problems to be managed, exploited, or completely eradicated. Armin notes a chilling historical fact here. The first concentration camps weren't invented by the Germans.
Wait, they weren't?
No, they were used by the British against the Boers and native Africans in South Africa during the Boer War.
Wow.
The concept of rounding up a civilian population and placing them completely outside all legal frameworks, that was born in the imperial periphery.
This leads to one of her most vital concepts, the boomerang effect. The techniques of mass terror, bureaucratic massacres, and biological racism were forged in the colonies. But overseas, imperialism at least kept a geographical distance. There was an ocean between the civilized capital in London or Paris and the brutal reality of the colonies.
The ocean provided a buffer.
Right. So how does that brutal reality boomerang back to Europe? What happens when that geographical distance vanishes?
The distance vanishes through the rise of what Arendt calls continental imperialism.
Continental imperialism, like what specifically?
We are talking about the pan-German and pan-Slav movements. These movements didn't want colonies in Africa. They wanted to expand across the European continent itself.
Oh, they wanted empire at home.
Exactly. They sought ethnic solidarity that completely ignored existing state borders. They claimed a tribal loyalty that was explicitly hostile to constitutional law.
Because constitutional law is based on territory. If I live in Germany, I am a German citizen regardless of my ethnicity. That's how a republic works. But these pan movements say, no, citizenship is fake. I am part of the Germanic race or the Slavic race, regardless of what country I live in.
Right. They replaced the legal concept of citizenship with a biological tribal concept of blood.
And by doing so, they completely bypass the state.
Yes, and they developed something completely novel in European politics.
Right.
The concept of the movement as opposed to the party.
What's the distinction there?
Well, a traditional political party wants to win an election, right? They want to run the government within the existing constitutional rules. A movement, on the other hand, wants to destroy the entire framework.
They don't want to win the game. They want to burn the stadium to the ground.
Exactly. They viewed the state merely as a temporary instrument to achieve their racial destiny. This was the direct ideological precursor to Nazism and Bolshevism.
So let's look at the crystallization point here. We have the collapse of the nation-state's legitimacy. We have the weaponization of anti-Semitism against minorities. We have the imported bureaucratic violence of imperialism and the tribalism of the pan movements.
All churning together.
And then World War I happens. The empires fall, the economies crash, millions of refugees are created, and all these toxic streams collide. Which brings us to the core of her thesis. Totalitarianism.
The ultimate crystallization.
Yes. And we have to ask, who actually supported these movements? Because Arendt drops a completely counterintuitive bombshell here about the nature of the totalitarian recruit.
It remains one of her most profound insights, honestly. When investigating who joined the totalitarian movements, her answer is not the historically oppressed, it's not the poorest of the poor, or the traditional criminal class.
So who was it?
The primary recruits were the politically indifferent, the apathetic, the massive, unorganized populace who had never joined a political party, who hardly ever voted, who had basically been written off by the traditional establishment as completely irrelevant.
Wait, how does that work? The people who didn't care about politics at all suddenly became the fanatical shock troops for Hitler and Stalin.
It has everything to do with the total collapse of the class system after World War I. When the structures that used to organize European life broke down, your trade union, your church, your political party, your professional association, people lost their sense of belonging.
The institutions crumbled.
They did. And people lost the institutions that gave them a defined place in the world. This produced what Arendt calls the masses. And a mass is fundamentally different from a class.
Let's explore the psychology of this mass man. Because he's not defined by inherent evil or brutality, is he?
No, not at all. The chief characteristic of the mass man is his radical isolation, his profound social atomization. He is radically lonely.
Lonely. That's such a striking word to use for a political terror movement.
But it's accurate. He has no normal social relationships, no shared reality with his neighbors. Totalitarianism stepped right into that agonizing void. It offered these floating, disconnected individuals something conventional parties couldn't. An identity.
A role in a massive, fictitious world historical drama.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. I'm going to push back a little on the psychology here. Because you'd think an evil regime needs evil supporters. Sadistic people. But Arendt is saying they just needed lonely supporters. How does submitting to a murderous dictator, mathematically or psychologically, cure loneliness?
There's a dark transaction.
Because if I give up my free will and just march in a uniform, aren't I just becoming an automaton? How does that make me feel less alone?
Well, because loneliness, in Arendt's definition, isn't just about being physically by yourself in a room. It's the feeling of not belonging to the world at all, of having no shared reality. When the mass man joins the totalitarian movement, he surrenders his individual judgment, yes, but in exchange, he is handed a completely cohesive, simplified, shared fiction.
Oh, I see. He gets a script.
A script that gives him extreme purpose. The movement says, you matter. You are part of the great racial struggle for survival. Or, you are the vanguard, the dialectical unfolding of history. Marching in lockstep cures the loneliness because you are finally part of a collective that acknowledges your existence.
Even if that existence is entirely subsumed by the ideology.
The surrender itself is the cure for the isolation.
It's a chilling thought that extreme isolation is the psychological precondition for mass terror. They didn't need a nation of psychopaths. They just needed a nation of profoundly lonely people.
And that is terrifying.
It is. But once the totalitarian regime was actually in power, its ultimate goal wasn't just to rule over these lonely people. A standard dictatorship just wants obedience, right? Pay your taxes, stay quiet, don't rebel. Totalitarianism wanted total domination. They wanted to change human nature itself.
They wanted to fabricate a new kind of human.
And the central institution where this was perfected was the concentration camp.
Yeah. Arendt argues that the camps were not merely prisons for enemies of the state. That's a misunderstanding. They were the true laboratories of totalitarianism.
Laboratories?
Yeah.
What were they experimenting on?
Their purpose was to eliminate human spontaneity entirely, to prove that total domination was, in fact, possible. And she details a highly systematic, three-stage process for destroying personhood inside these camps.
This is perhaps the darkest part of the text, but it's so essential to understand the mechanics of terror. Let's walk through it. Stage 1, targets the juridical person.
Right, which brings us right back to the statelessness we discussed at the beginning.
Yeah.
The first step is killing the juridical person. You strip the individual of all legal rights.
You place them completely outside the protection of any law.
Yes, so that absolutely anything can be done to them without consequence. You make them stateless entities. They are no longer citizens. They are administrative inventory.
The loss of the right to have rights. We've seen that. But stage 2 is where it becomes even more insidious. Stage 2 is the destruction of the moral person. How do they achieve that? Because you can take away my passport, you can take my citizenship, but how do you take away my conscience?
They destroy the moral person by creating situations where moral choice becomes literally impossible. The regime forces the victims to become complicit in the crimes.
Okay.
Arendt uses the horrific example of the Sonderkommando inmates who were forced, under threat of immediate death, to operate the gas chambers and dispose of the bodies of their fellow prisoners.
That is just incomprehensible cruelty.
It is. By doing this, the regime destroys the distinction between victim and perpetrator. It ensures that the camps produce not only death, but paralyzing, world-shattering guilt. They murder your conscience before they murder your body. If every choice you can possibly make is a betrayal of your fellow man, morality ceases to exist.
You are forced into a corner where humanity is structurally impossible. It's a nightmare. And then, if you somehow survive the destruction of your legal status, and you somehow survive the destruction of your moral agency, the regime targets the final stage, the destruction of individuality itself.
The third stage is the annihilation of the unique individual. This is achieved through the shaving of heads, the tattooing of numbers, the grotesque uniforms, the systematic physical degradation.
Stripping away any marker of who you used to be.
Exactly. The goal is to reduce human beings to what Arendt calls bundles of reactions, completely predictable, responding to stimuli mechanically, like Pavlov's dogs. Once you destroy the legal status, the moral agency, and the unique individuality, you have completely eliminated the human capacity to start something new.
You've destroyed human spontaneity.
You have fabricated a completely compliant subhuman entity.
It's the ultimate annihilation. It's not just killing people, it's killing the very concept of humanity.
It is the darkest depth of the totalitarian project.
So, having explored the physical laboratories of terror, the camps, we have to pivot and look at the psychological laboratories of totalitarianism. How do these regimes control the minds of the masses outside the camps? Because reading Arendt's warnings from 1951 about propaganda and truth, I mean, it feels like it was written yesterday.
It is staggeringly prescient.
It maps onto our 2026 era of digital disinformation in ways that are deeply, deeply unsettling.
It really does. Arendt's analysis of totalitarian propaganda reveals a fundamental misunderstanding most people have today. We tend to think propaganda is just the government lying to us.
Right, covering up a scandal or faking a statistic.
Exactly, but Arendt argues that totalitarian propaganda does not aim to deceive people into believing specific false things.
Wait, if the goal isn't to make you believe a lie, what is the point of the propaganda?
The goal is much more radical. The goal is to destroy the distinction between truth and falsehood entirely, to obliterate the very category of truth.
That is a massive shift in perspective.
It is. Think about it. If a regime tells you today that a specific historical event was heroic, and then tomorrow tells you the exact same event was an act of treason, and the next day says it never happened at all, they aren't trying to persuade you of a specific narrative.
They're just confusing you.
They are trying to produce a state of mind where consistent, independent judgment becomes utterly impossible.
Because if you can't trust your own eyes, if you can't rely on basic observable facts, you're entirely dependent on the leader to interpret reality for you. It induces a kind of intellectual vertigo.
Precisely, intellectual vertigo.
Yeah.
And this is achieved through what she calls the tyranny of logicality.
The tyranny of logicality, how does that work?
Totalitarian ideologies take one premise like history is a class struggle or nature is a race struggle, and they logically deduce absolutely everything from it. They ignore all real-world evidence to the contrary. If you accept premise A, you must blindly accept B, and then C, right down to the murderous conclusion.
It creates a fictitious world of rigid consistency.
Yes. And remember the mass man we discussed earlier.
The isolated, lonely individual.
Right. That rigid consistency is exactly what they crave as an escape from the chaotic, unpredictable reality of their actual lives.
So what does this all mean for you listening today? I want to be very clear here, and we have to state this explicitly. We are not taking political sides here.
No, not at all.
We are taking Arendt's historical mirror and holding it up impartially to behaviors we see across the entire modern societal spectrum on both the left and the right. But her critique of the isolated mass society feels like a flawless diagnostic of today's political polarization.
It truly is a flawless diagnostic. Look at the breakdown of shared communal institutions today. Local journalism is dying, civic organizations are shrinking, people are increasingly isolated behind screens.
Curated by algorithms that feed them bespoke reality.
Exactly. We are producing a new kind of digital mass man. And Arendt identifies specific red flags in the populace that we can see waving vigorously right now.
Let's go through those red flags because they are crucial. What is the first sign that a society is vulnerable to this?
The first is a deeply paradoxical mixture of gullibility and cynicism in the public. Arendt noted that totalitarian subjects would believe the most absurd, baseless conspiracies, while simultaneously adopting a cynical posture that all politicians lie anyway.
Oh, wow. They are infinitely gullible to the fiction of their chosen movement and utterly cynical about objective reality.
That's exactly it.
That is incredibly familiar. It's the mindset of, I refuse to believe the official economic data or the election results, but I will absolutely believe this anonymous post on a message board because it aligns with my worldview.
Spot on. And that leads to the second red flag. People retreating from the chaotic, nuanced reality of the world into the comforting, rigid consistency of a fictional ideological narrative.
Because the real world is messy.
It's very messy. It's full of contradictions. The totalitarian fiction offers a simple story where the heroes and villains are clearly defined, and any facts that disrupt that story are instantly dismissed as fake news or propaganda from the enemy.
It's a defense mechanism against a complicated reality. And the third red flag. How does this affect public discourse?
The desire to win the narrative completely replaces the desire to understand objective facts. The truth becomes entirely secondary to whether a statement hurts the enemy or helps the in-group. Loyalty to the fiction becomes the only metric of value.
It's like, let me give you an analogy. It's like being in a room where someone keeps turning the lights on and off at random.
Okay, yeah.
Eventually, your eyes are just exhausted. You stop trusting your own vision. And you will just surrender and believe whoever promises to keep the lights on, regardless of what else they demand of you. The exhaustion of the populace isn't a side effect of the disinformation. The exhaustion is the point.
The exhaustion is absolutely the point. When people are exhausted and cannot form independent opinions about public affairs, they cannot organize resistance. They cannot hold a regime accountable to facts because facts no longer hold any political currency. Arendt warns that a people who have lost their grip on a shared reality are primed for totalitarian domination, whether that domination comes from the right or the left.
That brings us to the end of our journey today. We've traced these terrifying subterranean streams. We saw how the anti-Semitic scapegoating of a state-aligned minority, combined with the brutal, unaccountable administrative violence of imperialist rule, fed into a society that had completely atomized.
The traditional classes broke down.
Right, creating a lonely, isolated mass of people hungry for belonging and a simplified, fictional reality. And under the right pressures, those elements crystallized into the unprecedented horrors of the 20th century.
As we close, I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought. Hannah Arendt explicitly warned that totalitarianism is not just a historical anomaly that we defeated in 1945 and safely left behind in the history books.
It's not safely locked away.
No, it is a permanent potentiality. It is a virus that lives on wherever loneliness, social atomization, and the hunger for a simplified fictional reality take root. So, consider this. If our modern digital age is making us more connected by technology, but fundamentally more isolated from one another in our actual physical communities, are we inadvertently fertilizing the soil for the next subterranean stream to surface? Are we building the exact kind of atomized society that Arendt warned us about?
A question that demands our attention, now more than ever. The historical diagnostic landscape might be murky, but Hannah Arendt gave us the tools to see the fractures before the bone completely breaks. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep reading, keep questioning the narratives you are handed, and whatever you do, stay engaged with the real, messy, physical world around you.